So this is the brand new M3 iPad Air, and this is my beloved M4 iPad Pro that I've been using since launch. My iPad Pro is my everything from work, creative, leisure, you name it. But now Apple added the M3 chip into the iPad Air, so I wanted to try a little experiment. I wanted to switch to the iPad Air and see if I missed my iPad Pro. I noticed a few things, some right away, but some things that I genuinely just did not expect from the iPad Air. So if you're trying to decide between the iPad Pro or saving nearly half the amount of money and going with the iPad Air, this is going to be the video for you. Let's get into it. So I do want to tackle the elephant in the room first, which is that I have two different sized iPads. I went with the 11-inch version of the iPad Air side, and I do have the 13-inch version on the iPad Pro side. But outside of that, everything else is pretty much one-to-one when it comes to what you can do on these iPads. I just want to let people know that I'm not going to let that skew or bias me from a screen real estate perspective. Because I know that you can get a 13-inch version of the iPad Air, and vice versa, an 11-inch version of the iPad Pro. That's just a preference thing. And then to give some context on this specific situation, I'm dealing with the baseline version of the 11-inch iPad Air, which you can get from Apple directly for $599 with 128 gigs of storage, or you can even get it cheaper on Amazon for like $550, I believe, versus almost a fully loaded M4 iPad Pro. So this is the 13-inch variant. This has 1 terabyte of storage, 16 gigs of RAM, and I believe I spent about $1,800. So if you do the math there, the iPad Pro is almost 3 times more expensive than this iPad Air. But then if you want to get a more apples to apples comparison, if you look at the same screen sizes and the baseline versions, the 13-inch iPad Air is going to start at $800 and the 13-inch iPad Pro is $1,300. So I wanted to see if the iPad Pro gave me $500 worth more of value during this experiment. So let's first talk about the design before we get into my personal use cases of all the differences that I noticed between these two using the iPad Air as my main iPad for about 2 weeks. So the iPad Air is a little bit thicker than the iPad Pro. It is a 1mm difference going from 6.1 to 5.1 millimeters. And it also is a heavier iPad overall, especially when you are comparing the same exact screen sizes. You're getting about 45 less grams on the iPad Pro, which does make a decent difference after the fact, versus the iPad Air is a little bit heavier overall. But again, iPads are relatively lightweight for the most part, so extended periods of use, like in your hand or anything like that, is going to be more than fine. And when I took it in my backpack, it didn't feel like any extra bulk on me or anything like that. And about 90% of the time that I'm using the iPad, it's on a Magic Keyboard and it's on a desk, so I don't really feel the weight when it comes to moving it around or any lack of portability compared to the iPad Pro. Some of the hardware differences that you notice is that the Touch ID button is on the iPad Air, which we'll touch on in a little bit, comparing those two biometric unlock versions, and there is no kind of larger lock button on the iPad Pro. The rear of the iPad is a little bit different as well, mostly in the camera bump department, but the camera bump on the iPad Pro is a little bit bigger to house the LiDAR scanner, which the iPad Air does not have. The iPad Air just has that single shooter on the rear, which does make it for a more minimalistic design, similar to the iPhone 16e. But the biggest difference to me visually has to be the bezels. Again, I'm coming from the iPad Pro, and I've used an iPad Pro since 2018, so the bezel differences is something that I did notice right away, where the bezels are a little bit bigger on the iPad Air. Now, if I was choosing from the beginning between the two, and I didn't have them side by side, and I had never used an iPad Pro, I probably would not have noticed a difference in the bezel size overall, but that is something that I personally noticed, and something that I continue to notice over time. It didn't kind of just like disappear. But now, before we get into the biggest difference, which is going to be the screen and the display technology, and where that $500 mostly goes, a quick word from our sponsor Paperlike, which is going to be my ultimate screen protector recommendation for any iPad that you pick up. The Paperlike screen protector was actually the very first accessory I ever bought for my original 2018 iPad Pro. It absolutely changed the way I use my iPad, giving me that real paper feel right on my screen, and it's been almost 7 years and I still make sure that I have one for all of my iPads. I recently got the new iPad mini 7 and I knew I needed to throw a Paperlike screen protector on there because it just adds a whole new dimension with how I engage with the iPad mini. Paperlike's nanodot tech gives you the natural resistance of paper, letting you take neater notes, draw with precision, and even makes the sound of pencil on paper. Combine that with the new haptics of the Pencil Pro, and you have a match made in heaven. It is made for creators and doers. It's perfect for artists, designers, students, or anyone who wants the real paper experience in their digital workflow. And with its microbead tech, Paperlike keeps your screen clear and near glare free, making it as beautiful to look at as it is to write on. Not only do they give you 2 Paperlikes on there just in case you mess up, but they also are so confident in their product that they offer a 100-day satisfaction guarantee. So if you're ready to fall in love with writing on your iPad, give Paperlike a try with the link below. And now back to these iPads. So now let's get into these displays, because this is going to be the number one thing that I personally notice. And again, it's more obvious when you are side by side, and that's not the normal situation. But the $500 that you're spending extra going from an iPad Air to an iPad Pro is going to be in the hardware differences, mostly on the display, because the iPad Pro has an amazing display, right? You're dealing with a 120 Hz ProMotion Ultra Retina XDR display. Again, that's Apple's naming moniker, doesn't really mean too much, but the key thing here is that you can get up to 1600 nits of peak brightness, which is going to be able to tackle pretty much any environment, right? The display is second to none. I've already come out and said that I would spend $800 to $1,000 on this iPad if it was just a dummy display or a portable display, because that's how amazing that display is. But again, it's not something that people need, and it doesn't add any additional function. It's just something that's a beautiful display. And if you do use your iPad as a reference monitor, then yes, that's going to be something that you want to get into, but that's a very small percentage of people and doesn't apply to the 99.9% of people or prospective buyers. And then moving over to the iPad Air side, you have the traditional 60 Hz display. It is a liquid retina display, which is nice to have. And it only goes about a third of the way from a peak brightness situation, so you get about 500 nits of brightness on the 11-inch model, and then 600 nits of brightness on the 13-inch model. So again, it really just depends on what you need it for, and if the display is something that you absolutely yearn for, because I don't think it's worth the extra $500 in my personal opinion. And after me using this for about 2 weeks, sure, coming from 120 Hz to 60 Hz, was a little bit annoying, and it felt a little slower, and it felt maybe a little bit laggy. But if I wasn't coming from 120 Hz and I was used to it with an iPhone 16, I had never really gotten into ProMotion, this display is still beautiful, it's still more than fine, it's still nice and glossy, it's still very fluid, it still does everything that you would want it to, and it has some other kind of pro level features like the Apple Pencil Pro support and the hover support, which is nice to see. So from a display tech standpoint, that's what you're paying mostly for, and that's what I've noticed. You paid mostly for the hardware, because once we get into my use cases, you'll learn that the iPad Air can do pretty much everything the iPad Pro can. So now let's talk about those day-to-day performance use cases that I was mentioning. So with the iPad, the way that I use it for most of my higher end and task-intensive type of applications. So I'm using LumaFusion, Affinity Photo, I'm using AI a lot to help me out with certain things, so there's a lot of kind of pro-level work that I use, but I also use it for a lot of leisure and personal activities, like being able to book something for a family event or managing our personal finances. Like, I use my iPad for pretty much everything. And this is where the iPad Air really surprised me, because everything that I threw at the iPad Air, it handled it gracefully and amazingly. Because again, you still have an M3 chip in here, which is also in the latest version of the MacBook Air, and the M3 chip is no slouch, which gives us at least 8 gigabytes of RAM. Albeit, I do have 16 gigs of RAM on the iPad Pro, so you did see it in real world scenarios, like when I was exporting something in LumaFusion, it would take a little longer on the iPad Air than on the iPad Pro, but it wasn't like a 2x difference, and it wasn't kind of a detriment to my workflow or anything like that. When it came to physically editing the videos, the timeline scrubbed perfectly, there was no lag, there was no latency, it handled 4K 60 footage with no problem. I had 6 to 7 to 8 layers of video and audio going at the same time in LumaFusion, and there was no issues whatsoever, which was great to see. So I do think for 99% of people, the iPad Air from a power standpoint and from an internal hardware standpoint is going to be able to tackle everything that you throw at it, especially compared to the iPad Pro. Because again, you're not really paying for the performance of the iPad Pro unless you go to 16 gigs of RAM and you really need that really kind of like 1% push that maybe the iPad Air doesn't have. You're mostly paying for the hardware differences, which is one of the things that I did miss, which I'll save for the end of the video, but that is where your money's going towards. You're paying for the hardware, not really like an improvement in software overall. Because again, if you continue to go down the line, even on the accessories front, both of these iPads support the Apple Pencil Pro, both of these iPads support Apple Pencil USB-C, both of these iPads run iPadOS 18, they both have Stage Manager, they both have Center Stage, they both have extended monitor support, they both have their own Magic Keyboard with trackpad, but again, charging speeds are the same, and there's just a lot of similarities from a performance standpoint that the iPad Air has. So for the price of the iPad Air, in my opinion, is a much better bargain for most people. So again, I was blown away by the capabilities and all the stuff that I could do on the iPad Air, but there was two big things that I was missing personally when it came to the iPad Pro versus the iPad Air. Of course, the display was one thing that I've gotten accustomed to. I've been using the latest and greatest iPad Pro displays since 2018, so we're going on 7 years now. So kind of downgrading or looking at the more accessible option, I did feel it. But again, if you're coming from something that is a lot older, or maybe you have never even dealt with a 120 Hz ProMotion display, then that doesn't matter whatsoever. But the second thing that I did notice, which for me in the way that I use my workflow was a little bit detrimental and did take up a lot more time than I anticipated, was the difference between Thunderbolt and the difference between USB-C or USB 3.0 controller. So Thunderbolt allows me to transfer data much faster on my iPad Pro than the regular USB-C port on the iPad Air. And that, for me personally, is something that I did take into consideration and I did notice drastically. Like, I would transfer over a file that was 10 gigs in size. On the iPad Pro, it would be done within seconds, and on the iPad Air, it took a lot longer. We're dealing with about 3 to 4x the amount of time to transfer data. Now, if you don't deal with large data files a lot, you're not using external SSDs, and you're not relying on that too often for kind of important work, then it's going to be fine. It's still going to be nice that you're able to do that with USB-C, and you don't need like a lightning adapter or anything like that. You can just plug in directly into there and use other USB-C accessories, but just know that it's going to be much slower than the Thunderbolt 4 port that's on the iPad Pro. And that was my biggest notice, and probably the one and only reason that I would not be able to hold on to the iPad Air versus the iPad Pro. I want to talk about battery life because that's something that I did notice, which I was very surprised about. While both of the iPads on Apple's website are rated with the same amount of overall playback time in their unit of measure, the battery on the iPad Air is just a tiny bit smaller, but I didn't notice it lasting just a little bit more. And I think that's due to the fact that it's not pushing a 120Hz ProMotion OLED. So if you do want, again, the most out of your battery life and the most out of battery longevity on a day-to-day basis, I do think the iPad Air gives you just a little bit more. Not by much. I thought it was going to be much better compared to the iPad Pro, but the management on a battery level that the iPad Pro has been able to do, even though it's pushing a lot more power through its tandem OLED, I think it's something to give kudos for. But the iPad Air does win, but just wins slightly. And then last but not least, just out of personal preference sake, I despise Touch ID. Touch ID, especially in the form factor that it is on the iPad Air and all other iPads that don't have Face ID, I'm just not a fan of. So I really miss Face ID because the way that I use my iPad is I would sit down, tap the spacebar on my Magic Keyboard, and then I could swipe up on the trackpad because it saw my face and it would unlock. With the iPad Air, I have to do these like finger gymnastics where I tap the spacebar and then reach over, but if I have to make sure I have both of my fingers put in there because I don't want to reach over with one arm going like this to then be able to unlock it. So it just added an extra step of friction that I didn't like. Again, it's not detrimental, it's not the end of the world, and it doesn't change anything functionally. I just way more prefer Face ID on the iPad Pro than Touch ID on the iPad. So my ultimate recommendation is going to be the iPad Air, just because I don't think that for most people that extra $500 is going to give you what you want for those $500. And you know who you are if you need this display tech, and if you need Thunderbolt, and if you need a LiDAR scanner at the end of the day. So most people should gravitate to the iPad Air. Maybe the other few percentage of people like myself that really enjoy the iPad Pro can go that way. But the iPad Air is for those people that want maximum power at a budget price, and then the iPad Pro is for those people that have pretty much an open budget overall and are willing to pay for the bleeding edge. So which iPad would you choose? Would you go with the iPad Air because it's a much cheaper budget option and gives you pretty much 95% of the power? Or do you want all the amazing hardware upgrades that come with the iPad Pro, but you do have to pay a premium? Let me know in the comment down below. I'm always curious to know. I'm always going to go the iPad Pro, and I'm going to go back to my iPad Pro after this video is done. But the iPad Air definitely surprised me in terms of how much I can do with it functionally. I'm just missing a few of those nice little hardware features which are nice to have. But that'll do it, everybody. If you made it to the end, leave a little dolphin in the comments down below so I know you made it to the end. And if you want to watch more videos like this one, definitely check out one of these videos right here. And big shout out to Paperlike for always partnering up with 9to5Mac and making these videos possible. Until next time, peace everybody.